Let me share a story about two men. It's written by George MacDonald, who lived back in the 1870s. He wrote a story about a young man named Thomas. Thomas was a churchgoer. Thomas stood, he didn't know it, but he stood in this seat right here. He was right here. He was smarter than average. He did well in school. Back then, when you did well in school, you kept going on to school. Nowadays, you can do terrible in school and keep going on to school, right? So, aren't you going to college? Aren't you? So he just kept going and going and going. And he did so well. And back then, the best, kind of the smartest back then, went into, quote, religious teachings and theology schools and all. He did all that. He went before the bishop, and the bishop said, you should become a pastor, a priest. Back then, the smartest ones, because they could read Greek, they could read Latin, they could read all these French and German, and this was in England. And so he just kept going because he was smart. And so at the end of his training, they didn't have interns back then, but what they would do is you went for a year to a small parish, and they called you a curate, like curator, but a curate. You weren't a priest or a vicar yet, you were a curate, and you'd go to one of these real small parishes out in the middle of nowhere. So he's going to be a curate out for a year, and as he's going on the stage coach out, it took 2 days to get it. It was way out in the middle of nowhere. He spent the night in an inn. And while he was there, he was eating, and the gentleman next to him said, where are you going? Oh, I'm going to this place, to this old abbey, to be the curate. He goes, see, the man who was there was over here. He said, he was a skeptic. He said, boy, that's kind of stupid, isn't it? Foolishness. Why are you doing it? And he began to explain why he's doing it. Because I was smarter than average. I got through elementary school, the secondary schools, into the primary schools, into the colleges, and all of a sudden I found myself as a pastor or a curate. He goes, do you really believe it? Do you really believe it? And Thomas looked at him and said, no, I don't. I don't believe it. I just kind of like church. I like the music. I like the people. I like helping people. I'm very compassionate. I love all the things around church. But I don't believe in the power of the cross. He goes, well, why don't you go home? He said, well, I made a commitment for a year, so I'm going to go fulfill the commitment. So Thomas went to the abbey, and he loved it. He loved working with the people. He loved helping the elderly. He loved feeding the poor. He loved all the things around it, right? But you know what he hated doing? He hated making sermons. That's what they called it back then, because you had to write it down. I don't write my sermons down. I say them, but you had to write them down ahead of time. Well, he had no time for it because he didn't study the Bible, because he didn't believe in the Bible. So you know what he did? He used to steal his sermons. It's called plagiarism. Back then, nowadays, you get kicked out of your class, right, students, if you plagiarize? Well, back then, it was even worse. But they didn't have the internet. No one knew who was preaching down the street. So he would get sermons from other curates around the area, get them, they were written, and he would just read the sermon. Pretty easy, right? One day, he got a letter, and it said, you're stealing your sermons. Thomas, it was written by a man named Joseph. He didn't know who Joseph was in the congregation. And so he realized he had enough sense of justice that he had to, confront this guy. So he said, let's meet. He meets Joseph. Joseph is a poor, deformed man who sits in the back of the abbey every Sunday. And he looked at that man and he said, what's up? He said, you're stealing your sermons. I know, because I go to that other church as well where you're stealing the sermons from. And he said, let's meet. Let me read to you what they said. Joseph is the deformed man. Thomas is the curate. Early in their relationship, the two men share their stories in complete honesty. Joseph narrates his painful childhood of his being sent away to boarding school because he was an embarrassment to his family, and of the ways he learned to cope with the derision and jokes of other children. As an adult, he learned to deal with his deformities and get on with his life. But he remained dissatisfied with himself. Through a series of painful experiences, Joseph confesses that he discovered his heart was filled with envy, vindictiveness, and conceit. He concludes, I began to be aware that heavy affliction, as it was to be made so different from others, my outward deformity was but a picture of my inward condition. That summer, Joseph committed himself to a thoughtful reading of the New Testament, through which he became acquainted with the man, Jesus. By contrast, Thomas confesses his miserable condition to his new friend. I was brought up for the church. I passed all my examinations with decency, distinguishing myself in nothing. I went before the bishop and became a deacon. After a year, I was ordained. After another year or two of false preaching and parish work, suddenly I found myself a curate in charge of this grand old abbey church. The young clergyman confides that Christianity seems useless to him. He is utterly without direction, though he finds himself now pastoring this good little flock. In complete despair, he commits himself to meeting with Joseph regularly for the purpose of reading and studying together. The handsome young minister comes to respect and appreciate Joseph more than anyone he has ever known. And listen to these last words. With his help, Thomas moves from faith in an idea about God to faith in the living God. Faith in an idea of God. Everyone sitting here today has some kind of faith. If I were to ask you, do you have faith? Of course you would say, yes, I have faith. But do you have faith in a living God? In the person of Jesus Christ? Or do you have faith in the idea of God? Just kind of in the Christian teachings. And let me tell you, it is a miserable place to stay if you only have faith in the idea of God. Because you have no relationship to him. You have the rules without the relationship. You have the words without the person behind the words. Today, Easter, what's it, March 31st? 2013 is the day you should come to faith in the living God.